There was a time when he didn't second-guess his posture, his presence, or his decisions. He moved with the quiet weight of responsibility, not because someone asked him to, but because the structure of life seemed to rely on him by default. He held things together, schedules, emotions, crises, without narration or complaint. He wasn't praised for it, but he wasn't invisible either. He simply was the axis around which his world turned. But now something's off. His shoulders don't rise like they used to. His breathing feels shallow and managed. When he enters a room, he doesn't feel himself holding the space. He feels himself managing not to disappear in it. The posture of the body reveals more than the language. The slight collapse of the rib cage, the hesitation before taking up physical space, the subtle retreat in the neck. These are not signs of depression, but of displaced structure. Schnittze doesn't name the problem as emotional. He names it energetic. The man in front of him is not lost. He is unanchored. The core of the session isn't about identity or trauma. It's about orientation. What is masculine energy when it is not performed, not exaggerated, not forced into symbolic gestures? Schnittze suggests that masculine energy, in its uncorrupted form, is not about control or volume. It is about directional stability. It's what holds form when everything else dissolves. It's the frame, not the wall. But when that frame forgets itself, the whole system bends. This man didn't become soft because he wanted to. He became soft because no one reminded him that strength wasn't noise. That presence isn't performance. That the spine doesn't need applause to stay upright. What we're looking at is not weakness. It's the disorientation of someone who's been strong for too long without being seen as human. Now he hesitates to breathe deeply. Not because he's afraid of breath, but because he's unsure whether he's still allowed to take up that kind of space. And that, Schnittze says, is the first thing to rebuild. Not power, not voice, not identity, but structure. The right to exist vertically. When Schnittze speaks of male energy, he doesn't start with personality traits or emotional fluency. He starts with axis. He says masculinity, in its raw and unspoken form, is verticality, the ability to hold a straight line through the center of chaos without losing internal reference. It is not power over, it is alignment through. The vertical energy of a man is not an idea. It is a set of measurable functions inside the body: regulation of movement, control of breath, suppression of unnecessary reaction, a neurochemical profile built on testosterone, dopaminergic stability, long-term orientation. A man who is in his vertical energy does not leak through emotional unpredictability or posture inflation. His nervous system does not swing between peaks and crashes. He does not panic when uncertainty rises in others. He does not run toward approval. His eye movements are slower. His blink rate is stable. His focus remains even when the room gets loud. This isn't stoicism, it's neuromuscular conservation. Schnittze notes that men built to endure are not built to compete for attention, which is why their strength is often misunderstood. When verticality is lost, it doesn't look dramatic. It shows up as hesitation, loss of internal pacing, physical fatigue without cause. This is what happened to the man we saw earlier. He didn't collapse. He disconnected from direction. His life became horizontal, scattered across tasks, requests, external affirmations. But when he begins to re-engage with the question, "Where is my axis?" the system remembers. The body starts to pull upward, not to perform, but to re-establish order. The jaw unclenches. The breath deepens. The sacrum anchors. This is not confidence. This is structure. Masculine energy, in its healthy state, does not seek dominance. It provides continuity. The vertical does not demand recognition because it is not dependent on surface response. It is quiet not by nature, but by necessity. It is not slow. It is stable. When a man forgets that, when he begins to respond rather than orient, he loses his center. And what returns him to it is not motivation or emotion, but the somatic memory of standing fully inside his own direction. Schnittze explains that female energy, unlike male, is not structured around direction but modulation. It is cyclical, receptive, adaptive, not because it is weak, but because its biological purpose is fluidity. Estrogen does not stabilize focus the way testosterone does. Oxytocin, dominant in female neurochemistry, prioritizes connection, not clarity. This energy flows. It doesn't fix in place. And while flow is powerful, it cannot contain itself without something to shape it. She, the woman he once loved, was full of movement. Emotionally rich, verbally expressive, constantly shifting. He remembers how drawn he was to that. At first, it felt like aliveness. Her mood could change 3 times in a single conversation, and each shift felt like a new dimension. But over time, it began to wear him down. Not because she was wrong, but because she lacked anchor. She wanted him to hold everything, her joy, her doubt, her fear, without having built any structure to hold him in return. He tried to remain steady, but in doing so, he became the ground beneath her storm. And when the ground began to fracture, she didn't see it. She floated harder. This isn't criticism of femininity. Schnittze is clear. Water is not a problem, but it needs banks. Masculine energy is not more valuable. It is more directional. It carries the task of shaping the experience when the environment destabilizes. But when that energy is pulled too far into accommodation, when the man tries to become water too, the system collapses. He remembers moments where she cried, and he softened. Moments where she raged, and he softened again. But it was never enough. Because she wasn't asking for softness. She was asking. Your subscription and comment aren't just numbers. They're signals that decide what video comes next. Share your thoughts or ideas in the comments. They often become the foundation for news stories. Interestingly, over 90% of viewers watch my videos without subscribing. That's okay. It means the content pulls you in. But subscribing helps you stay updated with the next parts. Hit subscribe, and let's create the next video together. Asking for stability. And he no longer had it. He now understands. She didn't need him to feel more. She needed him to stand. But he had already forgotten how. There are men whose names we don't remember, but whose presence we've never forgotten. Not because they were loud, charismatic, or demanding, but because they held everything silently. Schnittze refers to this as masculine energetic containment, the capacity to absorb stress without redistribution, to remain stable when no one else can. This silence is often misread. In relationships, in family systems, at work, the quiet man is assumed to be emotionally absent. But physiologically, it's the opposite. His silence is a load-bearing mechanism. He feels everything, but he channels none of it outward. He redirects it inward, not as suppression, but as functional control. He remembers standing at the edge of a kitchen one night, his partner crying, the children tense, the house tense, and knowing that if he allowed himself to release even 1 ounce of what he was holding, the entire room would destabilize. So he didn't speak. He didn't cry. He didn't move. And no one thanked him for it. No one noticed. But the system didn't collapse, because he chose to be the part that wouldn't shake. There was a cost. The jaw stayed clenched for days. The breathing stayed shallow. The sleep came light and broken. But still he stood. This is the silence of men who are not disconnected, but required. Their energy is not expressed through communication, but through endurance. Schnittze cautions, this form of strength can become invisible even to the man himself. When no one reflects his effort back to him, he begins to believe that holding is easy, that it's expected, that maybe he's doing nothing at all. But structural energy doesn't need to be seen to be real. It just needs to stay. And that is what he did. He stayed when everything else wanted to fall apart. It wasn't that he didn't want to be held. It was that no one around him was trained to do it. There came a point where he questioned his silence. He started to wonder whether strength had made him distant, whether steadiness was mistaken for detachment, whether the right thing to do was to soften. Not just in tone, but in role. He allowed himself to feel more, to speak more, to step back from the invisible burdens and try to share them. It was framed as progress. He was told he was becoming more emotionally available, more open, more balanced. But what followed wasn't intimacy. It was disorder. Schnittze explains that structure is often criticized only after it's removed. When the masculine frame softens prematurely, not because it's integrated, but because it's pressured to dissolve, the system doesn't equalize, it collapses. Emotional openness, without regulation, becomes volatility. Shared responsibility, without hierarchy of containment, becomes diffusion. Families, teams, couples, they don't need identical roles. They need complementary ones. When he stepped back from his axis, no one stepped forward to replace it. They expected him to lead again. They just didn't want him to look like a leader. He began to notice a shift. His partner, once demanding more emotional expression, grew irritable when he provided it. His team, once craving more empathy, became anxious when he started second-guessing himself. What was framed as growth, in practice, removed the one point of orientation they trusted most, his certainty. This is the paradox of softening without stability. It feels kind, but it weakens the system. Schnittze doesn't argue against emotional presence. He argues for structural hierarchy in energy. Masculine energy isn't about being rigid. It's about being relied on. And when the man becomes too emotionally available at the cost of clarity, no one becomes more secure. They become more exposed. He admits now, he broke his own center because he wanted to be liked. And in doing so, he lost the very thing that made others feel safe around him, his unshakable orientation. What they needed wasn't more of his emotion. They needed more of his presence. But he had already traded it for approval. Some men are not loud, charismatic, or immediately magnetic. But when they enter a room, something shifts. Not because they demand attention, but because they do not lose position. Schnittze calls this gravitational presence, the energetic effect of internal consistency. The nervous system of others responds not to words, but to the absence of instability. A man who does not shift his tone to match emotion, who does not escalate under pressure, who does not offer explanations for simply being steady, becomes a point of reference. Not because people love him, but because their bodies trust him. He remembers when he was like that. He didn't interrupt. He didn't posture. He didn't adjust himself for approval. He just stood. And in that standing, people listened more. Not because he raised his voice, but because it was rare to find someone who wasn't reactive. When conflict appeared, he didn't retreat. He waited. When others panicked, he remained still. His energy wasn't passive. It was directional without display. He had gravity. This kind of masculine energy isn't taught through words. It's built through repetition of not abandoning self in high-pressure situations. It's neurological consistency, slow eye movements, steady breathing, minimal fidgeting, stable vocal tone. It's what Schnittze describes as signal without signal. Presence that isn't declared but registered. People don't follow men like that because they are exciting. They follow them because they stop looking around. The search ends when coherence is found. He didn't need to prove himself back then. He just had to remain intact. But the moment he began adapting himself to be softer, more liked, more expressive in ways that weren't truly integrated, the field collapsed. People started looking elsewhere. Not because he failed, but because his center began to oscillate. And once a man begins to shift in ways that betray his axis, the gravity dissolves. He is no longer the one others seek. He becomes the one they doubt, without knowing why. There is a difference between brightness and endurance, between passion and sustainability. Schnittze describes this distinction as the difference between emotional combustion and structural firekeeping. Female energy, by its nature, is expressive and cyclical. It expands and contracts, intensifies and recedes. It is built for responsiveness, not for constancy. Male energy, in its grounded form, is not reactive. It is preservative, not because it is less emotional, but because it regulates emotion instead of amplifying it. In crisis, this becomes visible. When things fall apart, people don't turn to the expressive figure. They look to the one who doesn't flicker. Not because he's stoic, but because he doesn't externalize chaos. He absorbs it, metabolizes it, and stays present. The man remembers when that was his role. There was a period, months of instability, where the people around him were consumed by panic, grief, and volatility. He didn't sleep much. He didn't complain. But he held the system, not by solving everything, but by staying consistent. His voice stayed low. His habits stayed intact. He carried the emotional weight no one else could hold. And because of that, the group survived. Biologically, male energy is built for this. Elevated testosterone correlates with reduced emotional contagion. Stress response under pressure activates cortisol, but in a trained male nervous system, the cortisol clears faster, and dopamine pathways reinforce task orientation rather than despair. This isn't superiority. It's difference in function. Firekeeping is not louder than expression. It's just quieter, and more necessary when resources run out. He now understands that his value wasn't in how much he said, how emotionally available he became, or how well he shared his inner world. It was in the fact that when the room lost shape, he didn't. And he knows now that flickering, for him, is not honesty. It's failure of role. Restoration is not a performance. It happens without noise, without explanation, and without seeking validation. Schnittze describes the return of masculine energy not as a breakthrough, but as a recalibration. The body stops compensating. The breath moves lower. The nervous system stops scanning the environment and begins anchoring into the spine. There's no adrenaline, no intensity, just the quiet reappearance of direction. The man doesn't say he's back. He just stops collapsing. He no longer tries to be liked. He no longer performs empathy in ways that feel dishonest. He doesn't need to explain his choices. The feedback loop of external approval loses priority. Internally, he feels a shift, less reaction, more pacing. Less expression, more containment. The people around him start to sense it, but no one can name it. It's not charisma. It's orientation. He is not moving faster. He is moving straighter. He is no longer confused about the difference between being emotionally aware and being emotionally led. He no longer fears being misread as cold, because warmth, without boundary, becomes exposure. He has stopped inviting people into his center who do not know how to stand in theirs. This is the return of the axis, not an idea, not a mood, but a somatic state. He breathes, and the body expands down instead of up. The voice drops in tone. The face becomes still, not hard. Presence replaces intention. Schnittze ends the work here not with praise, but with observation. Masculine energy, at its most integrated, is invisible to those who look for noise. It doesn't take control. It holds ground. It doesn't lead by command. It leads by coherence. It doesn't ask to be trusted. It simply stops betraying itself. This is not a man who learned to be strong. This is a man who stopped abandoning the part of him that already was.